The fog was a living thing, perpetually clinging to the jagged coastline, a damp, gray shroud that swallowed the village whole. It muffled the world, reducing the distant cries of gulls to spectral whispers and the relentless crash of waves to a low, rhythmic sigh. For me, Reed, the lighthouse keeper, this was simply the texture of existence. My days bled into one another, indistinguishable as the layers of mist that veiled the horizon. My life was a precise, unvarying ritual. The first task, always, was the lamp. I climbed the winding iron staircase, each step a familiar groan, until I reached the lantern room. The air up there was thick with the metallic tang of salt and the faint, sweet scent of lamp oil. I'd check the mechanism, clean the thick glass lens until it gleamed, a solitary eye against the encroaching gloom. Then I'd watch the beam slice through the gray, a comforting, if lonely sentinel against the vast, indifferent ocean. Breakfast was a solitary affair. Stale bread, strong tea, eaten at a small, scarred table in my quarters below. The only sounds were the creak of the old building, the distant, mournful bleat of the foghorn. My own, operated by a pull cord I'd activate every few minutes when the fog was thickest. And the incessant, rhythmic churn of the sea. I rarely spoke, even to myself. What was there to say? The gulls didn't answer, and the waves offered no conversation. The village below, when the fog momentarily lifted, was a collection of hunched, weather-beaten cottages, their windows like vacant eyes. A few fishing boats bobbed in the tiny harbor, their masts skeletal fingers against the sky. I saw the villagers rarely, mostly when I descended for supplies, flour, oil, a few tins of preserved food. Our interactions were brief, perfunctory nods, a few mumbled words about the weather or the fishing. They saw me as part of the landscape, another unchanging fixture, much like the lighthouse itself. And I, in turn, saw them as distant, almost two-dimensional figures, their lives a blur of activity I no longer understood or desired to be part of. Isolation had ceased to be a burden. It had become the very fabric of my being. The monotony was a balm, a quiet hum that filled the empty spaces in my mind. Until it wasn't. It began subtly, so subtly that I almost dismissed it as a trick of the wind. Or perhaps the low thrum of the lighthouse generator. Though I'd never heard it quite like this before. It was a sound that seemed to emanate not from the air, but from the very bones of the earth. A deep, resonant vibration that I felt more than heard. A low, persistent hum. I first noticed it late one afternoon as the fog thickened to an impenetrable wall, pressing against the lantern room glass. I paused, my rags suspended, listening. The usual symphony of the lighthouse, the gentle clank of the lamp mechanism, the distant groan of the foghorn, the ceaseless sigh of the waves, continued unabated. Yet, underneath it all, a new note had been added. It was too low to be distinct, a sound that bypassed the ear and resonated somewhere in the marrow. Was it the wind? A particularly strong swell hitting the cliffs below? For a moment, I dismissed it. My ears, perhaps, were playing tricks on me in the profound solitude. My mind, accustomed to such quiet, might be inventing sounds. I resumed my cleaning, but the hum, once perceived, refused to recede. It was like a forgotten melody, suddenly recalled, now impossible to ignore. It wasn't loud, not yet, but it was there, a constant, unwavering presence. Over the next few days, it grew, imperceptibly at first, then with a creeping certainty. It wasn't a sound that swelled and faded with the tides or the wind. It was constant, a bedrock beneath the usual cacophony of the sea. I began to notice it most acutely in the quietest moments. Late at night, when the foghorn was silent and the waves seemed to hold their breath. Nothing. It wasn't coming from the land either. No, the more I listened, the more I felt its origin. It was from the ocean. Not the surface, not the crashing breakers, but from the deep. It was a sound of immense, ancient patience. A vibration that spoke of unfathomable pressure and boundless, unseen things. And it was growing. The hum wasn't coming from the lighthouse. I checked the generator, the structural integrity of the tower, every rattling pipe and loose pane of glass. Not a single loose screw, not a strained wire, not a faulty mechanism. The old beacon stood solid, a steadfast sentinel against the encroaching fog, its light sweeping the gray expanse with mechanical precision. But the hum, it was still there. It had followed me down the winding steps, past the living quarters, and out into the small enclosed yard. My initial dismissal, that tired resignation to an auditory hallucination brought on by isolation and the relentless ocean, began to fray at the edges. This wasn't a phantom. It was a physical presence. I walked the perimeter of the lighthouse grounds, my boots crunching on the wet gravel. The fog, thick and cloying, swallowed the village below, leaving only the faint, distant glow of a few streetlights as hazy smudges, something metallic and sharp, like the tang of a forgotten battery. Then I saw it. The small, weathered compass I kept on the windowsill of my ground-floor office, a purely aesthetic piece, began to tremble. Not a violent shake, but a rapid, almost imperceptible quiver like a nervous bird. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cool glass. The vibration was undeniable. It was the hum. It was doing this. My gaze snapped to the other objects in the room. A half-empty mug of coffee on my desk, its ceramic surface rippled with miniature waves, the liquid within dancing a silent jig. The brass bell I used to announce visitors hanging by the door swayed with a barely perceptible shimmy, its clapper nudging the rim with an almost inaudible tick, tick, tick. This was no hallucination. This was impossible. I forced myself to breathe, to think. There had to be a logical explanation. A geological tremor? Unlikely. The ground wasn't shaking under my feet. A massive piece of industrial machinery somewhere in the village. Perhaps an old, forgotten factory rumbling to life. The village was small, mostly fishermen and a few retired folk. There was no industry save for the processing plant down by the docks, and that ran on a predictable schedule, its noises familiar. This hum was alien. I stepped outside again, my eyes scanning the dense fog. The lighthouse beam cut through it, a solid, golden sword, but even its light seemed to be behaving strangely now. Where it struck the swirling vapor, the light fractured, not into prisms, but into shimmering, distorted patterns that shifted and warped. It was as if the very air was a flawed lens, bending and twisting the light in ways that defied physics. The edges of the beam, usually crisp and defined, now seemed to ripple like water disturbed by an unseen force. I squinted, trying to make sense of the visual anomaly. Was it my eyes? Was the fog playing tricks? It was real. It was happening. I started walking towards the edge of the lighthouse cliff, drawn by an unsettling curiosity. The hum seemed to grow stronger with every step, a low, guttural growl that resonated deep within me, making my teeth ache. The ground beneath my boots felt alive, a faint, constant tremor that was just on the cusp of being a full-blown shake. The air itself felt thick, buzzing with an unseen energy. I could see the distant lights of the village, now more like smudged watercolor blurs than distinct points. As I watched, one of the streetlights, a familiar sodium lamp that usually cast a steady, sickly yellow glow, flickered. Not a quick electrical short, but a slow, deliberate pulse, its light expanding and contracting as if breathing. Then another, and another, until a whole section of the village below seemed to be throbbing with this strange, rhythmic illumination. My mind raced, frantically sifting through every possible explanation. Faulty wiring? A power surge? But the lighthouse's own systems were stable, powered by an independent generator. And the hum wasn't electrical. It was too organic, too deep. The stone vibrated, a subtle, continuous tremor that echoed the hum in my ears. It wasn't just objects now, it was the very structure of the world around me. I was alone. Alone with a hum that was not only audible but visible, tangible. Alone with a world that was subtly, terrifyingly coming undone. And the worst part? I still couldn't find its source. It wasn't from anywhere. It was everywhere. It began to bleed into the world, to stain the edges of my perception. It started subtly, as all true horrors do. Fleeting geometric patterns, intricate and impossible, would shimmer in my peripheral vision. Not like optical illusions born of tired eyes, but complex shifting designs that seemed to exist just beyond the reach of direct sight. A tessellation of acute angles, a helix twisting into itself, a fractal bloom that defied the laws of Euclidean geometry. They would flare into existence, crisp and defined for a fraction of a second, then dissolve into the fog-thick air the moment I tried to focus on them. I'd shake my head, blink hard, and tell myself it was the isolation. The peculiar quality of the light here, filtered through perpetual fog. My mind playing tricks. But the patterns grew bolder, more insistent. They'd flash at the corners of the control panel, dance along the steel railings of the winding stairs, even briefly etch themselves into the swirling mist outside the lantern room's glass. Each appearance was accompanied by a subtle intensification of the hum, a pressure building behind my eyes. At first, I dismissed them as the wind, a trick of the air currents around the ancient stone. The lighthouse was a symphony of groans and creaks, especially on a blustery day. But these were different. They were carried on the wind, yes, but they weren't the wind. Indistinct, breathy fragments of sound that felt like they were spoken just at the threshold of hearing, just on the cusp of meaning. A low murmur, a sibilant sigh, a ghost of a word that evaporated before my conscious mind could grasp it. "Hello?" I'd call out, my voice swallowed by the vastness of the sea and sky, the fog muffling even the echo. Just the wind, but my gut twisted with a certainty that it wasn't. And the lighthouse itself, my steadfast companion, my mechanical heart of the sea, began to betray me. It started small, not a flicker, not a dimming, but a slight, almost imperceptible waver, as if its internal rhythm had briefly stumbled. The timing, so precise, would subtly shift, throwing off the predictable cadence by a fraction of a second, only to snap back into perfect synchronization. I'd watch the clock, then the beam, then the clock again, my brow furrowed, convinced I was imagining it. Then, the mechanisms began to behave in ways that defied their engineering. The gears, always well-oiled and meticulously maintained, would sometimes emit a high-pitched whine that wasn't a sound of friction, but something else entirely. A sustained, almost musical note that resonated with the hum in my head. The pressure gauges for the hydraulic systems, usually rock steady, would occasionally twitch, indicating impossible fluctuations, then immediately return to normal, as if mocking my vigilance. Once, the foghorn, designed to emit a deep, mournful blast, let out a sound that was subtly, horrifyingly wrong. It was still loud, still a horn, but there was a quality to it, a resonance that felt less like brass and more like something raw, something organic, a drawn-out sigh of immense, unidentifiable sorrow. I checked every connection, every switch, every fuse. I ran diagnostics on the automated systems, poring over the readouts. Everything was green, everything was nominal. The lighthouse was functioning perfectly, according to its own internal logic. But my senses screamed otherwise. My initial calm, born of a lifetime of solitude and self-reliance, began to crack. I found myself pacing the lantern room, hands clasped behind my back, my gaze darting from the shimmering fog to the inscrutable machinery. Was this the isolation finally getting to me? Had the endless gray, the constant roar of the sea, the monotonous rhythm of my duties finally eroded my mind? Was I simply breaking down, succumbing to a slow, insidious madness? The thought was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. I had always prided myself on my resilience, my unshakable focus. It felt like the core of the world had shifted, groaning under an unseen weight, and I, Reed, was the only one close enough to hear its complaint. I had to find its source. I began a methodical search, starting at the lantern room, the glass gleaming with an unnatural sheen in the perpetual fog. I checked the intricate clockwork mechanism, the gears turning with their familiar metallic rhythm, perfectly synchronized, utterly silent save for their own precise movements. No hum there. The hum intensified with each level down, as if drawing me into its heart. No machinery here was active enough to produce such a profound, pervasive vibration. I pressed my ear against the thick concrete foundation, the hum now a palpable presence, a deep, guttural note that seemed to emanate from below me, from the very bedrock the lighthouse was anchored to. It wasn't mechanical. It was organic, vast, and utterly inexplicable. My own breath hitched in my throat, each inhale a sharp, shallow gasp. Frustration clawed at me, hot and sharp. The lighthouse offered no answers, only amplified the question. I needed another avenue, another perspective. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, began to fray at the edges. Others must have heard it, I thought, a desperate hope clinging to the thought. Others must have recorded it. I made my way to the small, dusty alcove off the main living quarters, a space usually ignored, filled with forgotten maritime charts and the lighthouse's historical logbooks. These weren't the meticulous operational records I kept, but older leather-bound tomes, their pages brittle with age, filled with the cramped, fading script of my predecessors. Most entries were mundane. Weather observations, supply requests, repairs. I flipped through them, my fingers leaving trails in the thick dust, a sense of urgency building within me. Hours passed. The hum, ever present, seemed to swell and recede with my heartbeat. Then I found it. A logbook from the late 1800s, its spine cracked, pages yellowed and foxed. The early entries were typical, but then a shift. A keeper named Elias Thorne, his script growing shakier, less formal. Deck 12th, 1897. The fog has swallowed the village whole. The light pierces not but a few yards, and the sound, it grows. It is not the tide nor the wind. It is a song, low and vast. My breath hitched. The deep song. I turned the page, a tremor in my hand. Jan 3rd, 1898. Sleep eludes me. The song is constant now. It pulls at the edges of my mind. The villagers do not hear it. They look at me with pity. But I know. It is not madness. It is real. Thorne's entries grew more fragmented, filled with unsettling observations. Feb the 19th, 1898. The light means nothing. I feel it watching, from the deep. I found another, even older log. A keeper named Thomas Finch, 1750s. March 7th, 1752. A slow, rhythmic beat that vibrates through the very stone of this tower. My heart echoes it. I feel the immensity below, stirring. And later. April 1st, 1752. The fog is a shroud, and within it, I sense eyes. Not human eyes. Older, patient. The ocean is not merely water. It is a skin, and beneath it, something slumbers, dreaming its deep, resonant dream. My fingers trembled as I closed the book. These weren't isolated incidents. This wasn't a malfunction or a trick of the mind. The hum wasn't just in the lighthouse. It was in the history. A sudden sharp crack from the fog-shrouded window made me jump, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was only the old wood settling, but in my heightened state, it sounded like a warning. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. The cryptic words of the old keepers echoed in my mind, their fear becoming my own. It is calling. The fog outside, thick and suffocating, seemed to press against the glass, obscuring everything beyond. It was no longer just weather. It was a barrier, a veil. What was out there, beyond the limited reach of my light, beyond the sight of the village? What was watching? The solitude that had once been my comfort now felt like a trap, and I, Reed, was the sole vulnerable occupant within its walls. The hum was a lullaby to something vast and ancient, and I was listening. I was being listened to. A sudden, violent gust of wind rattled the lighthouse's lantern room, a sound like a giant's sigh, deep and mournful. Then, the first fat drops of rain splattered, not gently, but with a percussive force against the glass, quickly giving way to a relentless deluge. The storm descended with a ferocity I had never witnessed, even in this tempest-prone village. The wind howled, a banshee shriek that tore at the very fabric of the air. And the rain came down in sheets, blurring the world into a chaotic smear of gray and black. The old lighthouse groaned under the assault, its stones vibrating, its ancient timbers creaking like the bones of some colossal beast. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical presence, a deep, guttural vibration that seemed to distort the air around me, making my vision waver at the edges. The beam, a solitary defiance against the encroaching chaos, cut a swathe through the storm, but it illuminated horrors I wished it had left hidden. It was wrong. Beneath the lashing rain and the furious spray, the surface of the water did not simply rise and fall in waves. It contorted. Great swells formed, yes, but they did not break and recede in any natural pattern. Instead, they folded in on themselves, creating impossible angles, crests that seemed to bend inward, troughs that plunged to depths that defied the very concept of a surface. I saw shapes emerge and dissolve, fleeting geometries that my mind struggled to process. A wave would peak, not in a graceful curve, but in a jagged, crystalline apex, only to shatter into a pattern of impossibly straight lines that crisscrossed the water for a moment before vanishing. It was as if the ocean had become a canvas for a deranged architect, sketching structures that could only exist in a dimension beyond my comprehension. Then, a momentary tear in the storm. The clouds, momentarily rent by a supernaturally violent gust, parted just enough to reveal a sliver of the night sky. And what I saw there stole the breath from my lungs, freezing the blood in my veins. The stars. They were not fixed. They raced across the black expanse, not in slow, stately arcs, but in erratic, drunken zigzags. Constellations, familiar since childhood, dissolved before my eyes, their constituent points of light scattering like startled birds, only to reform in grotesque, alien configurations, then winked out as if they had never been. The very fabric of the cosmos seemed to be unraveling, a vast, indifferent tapestry being torn by unseen claws. The hum intensified, a roaring in my ears that threatened to split my skull. It wasn't just the lighthouse vibrating. It was the world. It was everything. My grip on the window frame tightened until my knuckles were white, my nails digging into the old wood. This wasn't a local phenomenon, a strange occurrence limited to this isolated village or this cursed lighthouse. This wasn't some natural disaster or a trick of the light. This was cosmic. The scale of it pressed down on me, heavier than any storm, more suffocating than any fog. My mind reeled, struggling to reconcile what my eyes saw with what I knew to be real. The ocean, the sky, the very laws of physics. They were breaking. They were shattering. My sanity, a fragile construct I had barely maintained, began to fray at the edges. This wasn't about my survival anymore. This was about the world itself, about the bedrock of existence. The hum was a symphony of destruction, and I, Reed, was merely a terrified spectator to the undoing of reality. The hum, that omnipresent vibration in the marrow of my bones, had found its voice. It no longer merely resonated. It spoke. A sound like dry leaves skittering across forgotten pavement, then a child's distant, melancholic laugh. I clamped my hands over my ears, pressing until my knuckles ached, but the sounds were not external. The child's laugh morphed, twisting into a choked sob, then into a wail that tore at the edges of my composure. It was her wail. The one I had heard only once, long ago, in a moment of profound, irredeemable failure. The fog, thick and cloying, pressed against the window panes of the derelict cottage I had found refuge in. But it was no longer just fog. It swirled, coalesced, drawing shapes from the gray nothingness. Then they sharpened. A face. It hung in the swirling mist just beyond the glass, a ghostly tableau illuminated by some internal, impossible light. My breath hitched. I scrambled back, tripping over a loose floorboard, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. No, I croaked, the sound raw and unfamiliar. Not real. But the entity, or whatever it was not interested in my denials. It was interested in my mind, in the deep, festering wounds I carried. The hum intensified, a roaring current now, and the visions no longer confined themselves to the window. The village outside ceased to exist. I was no longer in the cottage. I was back. There. The rain lashed down, mirroring the tears that streamed down my face. The screech of tires. The sickening crunch. Her voice, distant, fading. Reed, help me. The entity played it on an endless loop, each iteration more vivid, more excruciating than the last. I saw the fear in her eyes, the moment of realization, the desperate plea. I saw my own paralysis, my own cowardice, my own inability to move, to act, to save her. You stood there, you watched. The words weren't just heard, they were felt. They burrowed into my gut, twisting into knots of shame and guilt. The air grew heavy, suffocating, laden with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something metallic and cloying, like old blood. The lines between waking and nightmare dissolved. Was I screaming? Was I sobbing? I couldn't tell. My body moved without my conscious command, lurching, stumbling, clawing at the walls, at my own face. My fingernails scraped against my skin, leaving raw, burning trails. The past bled into the present, then into a future that was nothing but an endless replay of my failure. I was trapped in a temporal eddy, swirling through moments of regret, each one magnified, distorted, and weaponized by the entity's unseen hand. The fog outside now seemed to seep into the room, a tangible manifestation of the despair that choked me. Figures moved within it, indistinct, but always watching, always judging. They were the faces of all I had ever disappointed, all I had ever let down. Pathetic. The hum vibrated, not as a sound, but as an absolute truth impressed upon my very soul. Worthless. I collapsed, a broken heap on the grimy floorboards, my limbs spasming uncontrollably. My eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at nothing, seeing everything. The visions continued, a kaleidoscopic horror show of my deepest fears and unaddressed sorrows. The auditory assaults hammered at my eardrums, a cacophony of accusations, wails, and the ever-present insidious hum that was now the only constant in my shattered reality. My mind, once a fortress, had become an open wound, exposed and bleeding. Sanity, that fragile construct, had not merely frayed, it had disintegrated, scattering like dust in the relentless, invisible gale. I was no longer Reed. The blurring of lines was complete. There was no past, no present, no future. Only the hum and the unending self-inflicted torment it had so expertly orchestrated. The fog outside pressed in, a soft gray shroud over a world that no longer made sense, and a mind that had ceased to be whole. I lay there, shivering, my mouth agape, a silent scream trapped in my throat, utterly, irrevocably broken. But as the minutes stretched into an eternity, something else began to seep into the edges of my perception, something far more insidious than mere memory. At first, it was just a trick of the light, the flickering lamp playing games with my exhausted eyes. A coat hanging on a hook seemed to swell, its silhouette elongating into something spindly and hunched. A stack of books in the corner appeared to shift, their spines twisting, their pages fluttering as if disturbed by an unseen breath. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again, forcing myself to breathe, to rationalize. It was nothing. Just the aftermath of the shock. Just my mind trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. But the movements persisted. They were too elongated, too angular, their forms defying the natural laws of anatomy. Sometimes they seemed to possess too many limbs, scuttling across the floor with an unnerving, segmented grace. They were not real. They could not be real. They started as a faint rustling in the endless sigh of the fog, like dry leaves skittering across a distant shore. Slowly, gradually, they gained coherence, weaving themselves into a soft, insistent murmur that seemed to emanate from the very stone walls of the lighthouse. Come, to the deep. A chorus of voices, some childlike, some guttural, all ancient. It waits for you. Release yourself. The word ocean was repeated over and over, a siren song that clawed at the fragile edges of my sanity. I clapped my hands over my ears, pressing hard until my skull throbbed, but the voices resonated deep within my bone, a primal echo I couldn't escape. The lighthouse itself began to betray me. The familiar spiral staircase, my ascent and descent, a comforting ritual for months, started to undulate. Each step seemed to breathe, to expand and contract under my weight, the stone groaning like a living thing. The lantern room, once my sanctuary of light and purpose, warped into a monstrous maw, its glass panes like teeth. The powerful lamp at its center, a pulsating, cyclopean eye that stared out into the endless gray. My own body, too, became a stranger. I stared at my hands, once strong and capable, now appearing elongated and skeletal, the skin translucent, the bones beneath shifting and rearranging themselves with a sickening, audible click. My reflection in the grimy window of the keeper's room was no longer my own. Was this truly me? My isolation, once a chosen solitude, had twisted into a suffocating prison. There was no escape from the voices, no hiding from the impossible shapes, no refuge from the grotesque distortions of my own flesh and mind. The lighthouse, my only shelter, had become the epicenter of my torment, a monstrous entity that mirrored the shattering landscape of my soul. I was adrift, untethered, a living ghost in a world that had ceased to make any sense at all. The ocean called, and I felt myself swaying towards its unforgiving embrace. A silent, broken thing. The line between reality and nightmare had not merely blurred, it had dissolved entirely. The hum, that infernal, insidious vibration, had ceased to be an external sound. The air itself felt thick with it, a pressure against my eardrums that no amount of blinking or head shaking could dispel. I paced my small, gaslit room, the fog outside pressing against the window panes like a living, breathing thing. My eyes fell upon the old, sputtering generator in the village square. Perhaps, I reasoned in my delirium, breaking one source of sound would sever the connection, disrupt the unseen conduit. I grabbed a rusty crowbar from where it lay half buried near my porch steps and stumbled through the swirling gray, the generator's dull throb a perverse beacon in the gloom. When I reached it, a hulking silhouette against the swirling mist, I didn't hesitate. I swung the crowbar with all the strength I possessed, a frenzied guttural scream tearing from my throat. Metal shrieked against metal, sparks flew, and a shower of rusted components rained down around me. I hammered at its casing, its exposed wires, its sputtering engine, until my arms ached and my breath came in ragged gasps. The generator sputtered, coughed, and then, with a final dying groan, fell silent. A profound, absolute quiet descended. For a fleeting, glorious second, hope surged through me, a pure, clean draft in the suffocating chamber of my mind. It was gone. The hum was gone. Then, slowly, insidiously, it returned. Not from the outside, not from the silent generator, but from within. It resonated in my teeth, vibrated behind my eyes, a low, guttural growl that felt like my own skull was a drum. The external hum had been replaced by an internal one, deeper, more intimate, more terrifying. I stumbled back to my house, the fog now seeming to mock my retreat, coiling around my legs like spectral tendrils. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. If I couldn't destroy the source, perhaps I could seal myself off from its influence. I dragged every heavy piece of furniture I could move, an old wardrobe, a splintered chest of drawers, and shoved them against the front door. I nailed planks of wood across the windows, tearing at the rotten frames with frantic energy until my fingers bled. I stuffed rags into every crack, every crevice, every tiny gap where the outside world or the hum might seep in. The air became thick with dust and the smell of old wood. I was entombed. I sat in the center of the room, knees drawn to my chest, hands clamped over my ears, trying to block out the insidious vibration. But it was no longer coming from outside. It was me. My blood hummed. My bones sang with it. I was not alone. It was in here with me. Days blurred into a single agonizing eternity. Sleep offered no escape, only deeper dives into the hum's resonant nightmare. My mind, stripped bare of all logic, began to turn in a new, horrifying direction. If I couldn't fight it, couldn't escape it, perhaps I could understand it. Perhaps I could speak to it. I was mad, I knew it, but what choice did I have? I was a rat in a labyrinth, and the hum was the hand that turned the walls. I lowered my hands from my ears, the hum now a familiar, agonizing part of my existence. "What do you want?" I rasped, my voice hoarse from disuse, swallowed by the suffocating quiet of the sealed room. "What are you?" The hum intensified, not in volume, but in its texture. It changed. It became a vibration that wasn't just physical, but mental. My thoughts fractured. Images, not my own, flickered behind my eyes. Impossible geometries, vast, empty spaces stretching beyond comprehension, a sense of crushing indifference that dwarfed all human suffering. It wasn't a language of words, but a language of pure, unadulterated sensation, a direct assault on the very core of my consciousness. My mind reeled. It was like trying to speak to the ocean and having the ocean pour itself into your brain, drowning you in its unfathomable depths, showing you not answers, but the sheer, horrifying scale of its existence. It wasn't communicating. It was absorbing. It was taking, not giving. My desperate attempt to reach out had merely opened a new, wider channel for its influence. It didn't want to be understood. It wanted to be. And in doing so, it wanted to consume all that I was. Each desperate measure, each frantic act, had only served to deepen its hold, to amplify its power, to draw it further into the very fabric of my being. I was utterly, irrevocably helpless. The hum now sang in every cell, a constant, unbearable symphony of my own futility. I crumpled to the floor, my body trembling uncontrollably, tears streaming down my face. My efforts had been worse than useless. Each desperate measure, each frantic search, had only served to deepen the cracks in my sanity, to pull me further into the inescapable grip of the sound. The low hum, the incessant drone, now felt less like a sound heard with my ears and more like a vibration deep within my very bones, a resonance with something vast and unseen. The room spun, or perhaps it was my mind, unraveling thread by thread. My breath hitched, a ragged gasp that tore at my throat. The tears, hot and salty, blurred the dim outlines of my cabin. But beyond the immediate agony, something else began to coalesce. It wasn't a vision in the traditional sense, no sudden flash of an image, but a horrific clarity, a knowing that seeped into my consciousness like poison. It began with the fog outside, pressing against the window pane, no longer just a weather phenomenon, but a shroud, a membrane separating my fragile reality from something else entirely. The gray mist outside swirled with an unnatural intelligence, not observing, but being, a silent, pervasive extension of the very thing that had haunted my waking moments. The song intensified, not in volume, but in meaning. It was not a message. It was not a call. It was the sound of a fundamental being, a vibration of existence itself. It was a principle, an ancient, primordial fact. It was a cosmic indifference, vast beyond all measure, older than thought itself. My mind reeled, trying to grasp the scale of it. It wasn't a being from somewhere. It was a being of somewhere. A core element woven into the fabric of reality itself, yet simultaneously alien to it. It had no form that a human mind could perceive, no eyes to see, no voice to speak. The faint, persistent hum that had driven me to the brink was not a warning, not a threat, but simply the sound of its presence, the byproduct of its vast, incomprehensible existence. Its awakening was not an act of will, but a slow, inevitable turning of a cosmic wheel, a process that had begun eons ago and was only now reaching its culmination. The song, that maddening, all-encompassing drone, was merely the friction of its stirring, the sound of reality grating against its immensity. It didn't hate us. It didn't even know us. We were less than dust motes in the vast, silent chambers of its timeless slumber. Our world, our lives, our very minds were simply catching in the wake of its colossal, indifferent existence. The fog outside, I realized, was not just the village's weather. It was the entity's breath, its exhalation, a slow, creeping dissolution of the familiar. There was no fighting it, no reasoning with it, no escaping it. It was like trying to stop the tide by screaming at the ocean, or trying to prevent the sun from rising. The doom was absolute, not a punishment, but a simple consequence. The song wasn't a prelude to an attack. It was the sound of the world ending, not with a bang or a whimper, but with a slow, drawn-out hum as the fabric of existence frayed. This village, its people, myself, we were merely tiny, insignificant ripples on the surface of an ocean that was about to be swallowed whole by a greater, uncaring current. A profound sense of insignificance washed over me, heavier than any physical weight. My struggles, my fears, my desperate attempts to understand or to fight, they were ludicrous, childish. We were insects scuttling on the hide of a beast that was merely stretching after an impossibly long sleep. The beast was not even aware of us. Our entire history, our triumphs and tragedies, our hopes and dreams, were less than a fleeting thought to this ancient, indifferent presence. The air grew heavy, thick with the unutterable truth. My tears had dried, leaving salt tracks on my cheeks. But the trembling of my body continued, a low, constant vibration mirroring the song itself. There was no hope, only the slow, inevitable creep of an ending that had been set in motion before time began. The village, shrouded in its impenetrable fog, was merely the first to feel its touch. The world would follow. I pushed myself up, my limbs stiff and unresponsive, my eyes wide and unseeing. The world was not ending for a reason or by an enemy's hand. It was simply dissolving, like a dream forgotten upon waking, because something vast and ancient had stirred, and its awakening meant our inevitable, existential doom. The song was no longer an external sound. It was inside me, a part of me, woven into the very fabric of my being. The village, or what remained of my memory of it, was a phantom. The fog was no longer a veil. It was a substance, thick and viscous, seeping into my lungs, replacing the air, making each breath a struggle against a tide of gray nothingness. Cobblestones rippled beneath my feet, not with water, but with an unseen current, a tremor that ran deeper than the earth, a vibration of pure, unadulterated wrongness. My thoughts, once a torrent, were now fragments, shards of glass tumbling in a slow internal storm. I tried to grasp them, to string them into a coherent sentence, but they slipped through my mental fingers like smoke. Read. My name. Who? What am I? The song answered, not with words, but with a deep, resonant hum that filled the spaces where my thoughts used to be. A soothing, terrifying lullaby that promised an end to the struggle, an end to the pain. It was in this cacophony of internal noise, this dissolving reality, that the truth began to solidify, not as a thought, but as an absolute horrifying certainty. The entity, this vast, formless consciousness, was not just here, it was me. Or rather, I was its final, crucial vessel. My shattered mind was the last barrier, the last lock on a gate it sought to open fully into this reality. My suffering, my fear, my very existence were the fuel. And the song was its voice, its will, its promise of oblivion and ultimate communion. I stumbled forward, each step a testament to a will I no longer truly possessed. The fog thickened, condensing not into moisture, but into shifting, indistinct shapes that danced at the periphery of my vision. Echoes of past fears, half-remembered faces, twisted into grotesque parodies. They were not real, but they were there, conjured by the song to press me, to push me towards the inevitable. And then, the choice. It emerged from the swirling chaos, stark and brutal, laid bare before the last flickering embers of my consciousness. It wasn't a choice of action in the mundane sense, but a choice of being, a final act of will in a mind that had none left. Cease the struggle. Allow the final merging. Become part of the chorus, an indistinguishable note in its infinite symphony. The pain would end. The fear would vanish. I would dissolve into the vast cosmic consciousness, losing my individuality, yes, but gaining an eternal, tranquil oblivion. To become nothing, to simply be part of everything, to finally rest. My body sagged, drawn to the promise of such profound, final peace. But with that promise came the horrifying realization. If I succumbed, the entity would awaken fully. Not just in me, but through me, into the world, an echo of its vast, incomprehensible being spreading like a blight. It would be a new dawn, yes, but a dawn of eternal, silent horror for all. My suffering would end, but its reign would begin. The second option was a desperate, primal scream. Defy. Fight. Resist. But how? What weapon did a shattered mind possess against an entity that was already inside it, wearing it like a skin? I tried to clench my fists, but my hands were numb, formless. I tried to scream, but only a dry rasp escaped my throat, swallowed by the omnipresent hum. To defy meant to claw at the tendrils that had already wrapped around my very soul. To find a sliver of uncorrupted thought and wield it against an ocean. It was futile. I knew it. Every fiber of my being, every fractured thought, screamed the impossibility of it. It offered no escape, no victory, only a longer, more painful road to the same destination. And then the third. Sacrifice. Not just my life, but my very essence, my consciousness, in a way that would deny the entity its final step. If I was the gate, I had to destroy the gate. If my mind was the vessel, I had to shatter the vessel beyond repair, not just for myself, but for the world. It meant an irreversible act, a tearing apart of the last coherent fragments of Reed, a deliberate obliteration of the self, not to merge, but to cease. To become so utterly, fundamentally nothing that the entity could find no purchase, no path forward. It was a choice that offered no peace, no solace, no hope of continuity. It was the ultimate negation, a final act of utter destruction directed inward, to prevent an even greater destruction outward. The fog pressed closer, the shifting shapes at the periphery growing more menacing, more corporeal. I could feel the entity's impatience, its hunger, its vast alien consciousness brushing against the raw nerve endings of my soul. Succumb and become part of the horror. Defy and prolong the agony. Or sacrifice everything, the last vestiges of Reed, to prevent the entity's full, terrifying awakening. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of that impossible decision. My mind, a fragile glass, was on the verge of shattering, and I knew, with a horrifying clarity, that the next breath I took would determine not just my fate, but the fate of everything. The song had not ended. It had merely changed. The dissolving village wasn't gone in a flash of light or a thunderous collapse. It was unraveling, thread by invisible thread. When I pushed myself up, my limbs felt heavy, weighted with an understanding I hadn't possessed before, a kind of terrible clarity. The fog, always a presence here, had thickened into a solid, breathing wall. It swallowed the outlines of the few remaining structures, blurring them into formless gray specters. The air tasted of salt and something else, something metallic and ancient, like the inside of a forgotten tomb. Not an absence of sound, but a muffling, an absorption of all noise by the pervasive mist. Yet beneath it, I could feel the hum. It was no longer a piercing shriek or a maddening throb. It wasn't in me anymore. It was around me, through me, the very air I breathed, the ground I stood upon. I stumbled forward, my destination an instinctual pull. The lighthouse. The path to it, once a familiar route, was now a treacherous maze of shifting debris. Windows gaped like empty eyes in skeletal houses. Doors hung ajar, revealing interiors choked with mist, hinting at lives abruptly ceased, or perhaps simply absorbed. There was no sign of the villagers, no bodies, no trace. Just the unsettling, profound emptiness, as if they had never truly existed, merely been temporary patterns woven into the fabric of this place, now unraveled. My own choice in that final, terrible moment had been no choice at all. Faced with the stark, impossible options to become a vessel, a conduit, or to resist and be shattered, the entity had simply encompassed. It didn't demand, it merely was. And I, like everything else, was now part of its expanded awareness, a tiny, insignificant node in its vast, indifferent consciousness. My individuality persisted, a fragile spark, but it was now merely a perspective, a lens through which it could observe. Not the strong, sweeping beam I remembered, but a weak, stuttering flicker like a dying ember. Stood silhouetted in the doorway of the keeper's cottage, a hunched shape against the faint, internal light. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the pervasive hum. Was it? No, was too indistinct, too generic. It was a man, nondescript in every way, his shoulders slumped. He held a lantern, its weak glow doing little to pierce the dense fog. He moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, like a mechanism wound down to its last turn. He walked towards the base of the lighthouse, his gaze fixed upwards, towards the flickering light. He seemed utterly oblivious to me, to the dissolving village, to anything but the task that awaited him. He was the new keeper. He was the next. The realization settled over me with a weight heavier than any stone. The entity didn't need a specific person. It needed a presence, a focus. It didn't care about the individual, only the continuity of its influence. It had merely shifted its attention, its insidious pull finding a new anchor, a new victim to tend its indifferent flame. This man, drawn here by forces he likely didn't understand, was now bound to the lighthouse, to the hum, to the slow, inevitable process of absorption. I watched him enter the lighthouse, the heavy door groaning shut behind him. The faint light in the lantern room brightened slightly, then resumed its erratic flicker. The hum, which had momentarily seemed to quiet, now intensified. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air, a deeper resonance in the ground. It was the sound of a vast, unseen engine purring content. I was left on the outside, a survivor, perhaps, but a cursed one. The knowledge I carried was a brand, an indelible mark. I understood now that the horror wasn't personal, wasn't about me or the villagers or any single lighthouse keeper. It was an indifferent cosmic force, ancient beyond comprehension, existing outside the boundaries of human morality or understanding. It didn't seek to destroy, it simply was. And everything that came into its orbit was slowly, irrevocably altered, becoming part of its silent, expanding domain. The village was almost entirely gone, swallowed by the mist. I was not free. I was merely a walking echo of the hum, carrying the terrifying truth that this was not an end, but a beginning. My fate was not unique. It was merely a precursor, a glimpse into the larger, inevitable horror that would, in time, claim everything. The world would continue to turn, oblivious, until the hum became its only song. And I, Reed, would walk its edges, forever hearing it, forever knowing, forever alone.